Hey guys, Keisha here. It's been a while since I posted my only video to this channel. Turns out, dumping an hour plus video essay as your YouTube debut burns you out. Who knew? Anyway, I wanted to get at least one more video out before 2026, but the video project I was working on hit a roadblock, and life got in the way and it kinda just stalled out. Furthermore, I had these other ideas floating in my head, and they were just nagging me that pertained to the video I just made. So, to get that out of the way, I decided to make this video as a little addendum to my previous essay, in essence covering topics that were cut from the original and or things I may have wanted to cover in a future video, basically anything tangentially related to college football. Now, it's important to note, this isn't a college football, American football, or even a sports channel. I want this channel to be me yapping about topics I find interesting, particularly those that don't have any good videos talking about it already. In fact, the video I just mentioned is completely unrelated to sports, and I hope y'all see it sometime in the future. For now though, here are some topics that are related to my first video that I wanted to cover. This video extensively references my previous one, so I recommend watching that one first if you haven't already or need a refresher. With that, here are some topics I'm going to cover in no particular order and not particularly well organized. Timestamps if you need them. In the original video, I haven't really talked about Rutgers much despite them being credited as the inventors of the sport. After their original 1869 bout with Princeton, the only mentions of Rutgers were how they didn't attend Harvard's rugby meeting and how at some point in the 1970s they were in a higher division than Princeton. What was Rutgers' football situation like in those 100+ years? Well, to be honest, not that good, at least at the start. Following their 1-1 season against Princeton, they faced each other again in 1870, 1872, and 1874, with Rutgers losing all three matches. After soccer was changed in 1876 by the Ivy League universities, which, fun fact, college football is the reason why those schools are named that, Rutgers initially refused to switch due to not being party, but would relent the following year. The year after that, in 1878, they once again faced Princeton for the first and only time under rugby rules. They lost. Rutgers were faster to switch to Walter Camp's code once that came out, but their luck didn't improve. Starting in 1880, Rutgers would lose to Princeton an additional 28 times in a row. It wouldn't be until 1938, 69 years after the original game, 32 years after the founding of the NCAA, and even 18 years after the game went pro, that Rutgers would get their second win against Princeton. The two schools would play one more game together just before the outbreak of World War II, resulting in yet another Princeton win, leaving Rutgers with a 2-34 pre-war record. It wasn't that Rutgers was bad per se, they'd vastly improved through the decades and were even their conference champions 4 out of 5 times before 1938. It's just that they couldn't get the upper hand against their rivals. That changed when the two schools returned to play each other after the conclusion of the war. Rutgers still lost more than it won, but it was a much more reasonable 15 wins, 19 losses, and 1 draw, with many of the wins occurring in the later years. Their 66th match in 1975 was the last in which Princeton won, resulting in the following 5 going to Rutgers. They played their last match in 1980 before Rutgers stayed in the FBS and Princeton went to the FCS, marking the end of a 111-year rivalry. At least in football. Since the FBS-FCS distinction only exists in football, both schools are in Division I for other sports, meaning they frequently still spar in the likes of basketball and especially lacrosse, the latter of which is interesting, as while Rutgers overtook them in football, Princeton continues to be the powerhouse in lacrosse, with them winning 32 out of the last 35 matchups. The more things change, the more they stay the same. In 1978, historian Ian Turner noted a particularly sharp sports divide in Australia. People in the states of Queensland and New South Wales, as well as the capital and the nearby country of New Zealand, are major fans of rugby, particularly rugby league, while the rest of Australia are fans of the homegrown Aussie rules football. And not only did they massively enjoy their respective sport, many massively detested the other, seeing the other as fake football. Turner noted that such a divide could be cleanly drawn in a straight line from 2 points where state borders met the sea, and as he was giving a lecture on the Aussie Footy Hall of Famer Ron Barassi Sr., he dubbed it the Barassi Line. The Barassi Line still divides Australia to this day. The two sports' main leagues, the AFL and the NRL, only have 5 of a cumulative 35 teams on the wrong side of the line. It's hard to imagine such a divide for those outside of Australia. But did you know that the United States almost had its own Barassi line nearly 3/4 of a century before the Australian one was discovered? This stems back to that 1904 meeting in the White House over football safety that would lead to the foundation of the NCAA 2 years later. What I didn't mention was that while most schools in the northeastern and midwestern United States were willing to stick it out to make football a safer sport, Many schools on the West Coast, particularly in California, didn't think the changes could come fast enough for their liking, and instead decided to ditch gridiron football in favor of, wouldn't you know it, rugby. The two biggest champions of the switch were the Bay Area schools Stanford and UC Berkeley, who both switched to rugby union rules in 1905 after previously switching to Camp's Code just 19 years prior. The two rivals would play each other every year under that code, and would go on to play other schools and some private teams across California, as well as in Nevada and the Vancouver metro area. The American Barassi line was shaping up to follow the Sierra Nevada mountains, with those to the east playing gridiron football and those to the west playing rugby football, at least at first. In 1913, the various schools playing rugby would play against a national rugby team, the New Zealand All Blacks. How well did they do? As well as Rutgers against Princeton at the time. Out of the 16 games the All Blacks played in North America, 12 were against American universities and private clubs. They won all of them, outscoring their opponents 457-3, with only Berkeley getting any points on them. Contrary to popular belief, these losses weren't what caused the end of rugby in American universities in the early 20th century, as schools like Stanford and Berkeley continued to play rugby for at least a few years. What really caused rugby's downfall was twofold. One, despite the initial boost, very few schools, even in the region, completely switched to rugby and chose to continue playing American football despite the safety risks attached to them. That led to the rugby schools having very little competition. The second and bigger nail in the coffin was a lull in play during World War I, where schools stopped playing rugby altogether, and once the war was over, it was simply easier to switch back to American football and its improved safety conditions. Berkeley and Stanford ended the rugby football programs in 1915 and 1917 respectively, restarting their gridiron teams by the 1921 season. It ultimately worked out, as Berkeley would be national champions that year, and Stanford in 1926, leading to the American Barassi line just being a what-if to history. As stated in my original video, the FCS doesn't have as large a viewership as the FBS, but you'd be surprised by how large it still is, so let me give you a taste. As a reminder, the FBS had an average attendance of 40,492 per game in 2024. The FCS average of that same year was only about a sixth of that, at 7,026. Still, pretty impressive on the global scale. That's a higher attendance than that of the EFL League 2. Some individual universities are much higher than that. While some schools can barely muster up 1,000 in attendance, the team that tops the list, the Jackson State Tigers, averaged 27,213 per game. For comparison, that same year, Premier League club Fulham FC only had 26,833 per game. Let me repeat that again. A collegiate amateur team in the second division of its organization had a higher attendance per game than a professional team in the highest ranked soccer league in the world. If that doesn't convince you that Americans love college football, I don't know what will. One topic I wanted to briefly cover in the original video that I had to cut was what March Madness is. Unlike the other topics in this video, it actually has nothing to do with college football. March Madness is the playoff system that the NCAA uses for its Division I men's basketball program, which is used to determine its champion. It's the only time college athletics that isn't football gets the national spotlight, and is near the sole reason why men's basketball makes up 15% of the NCAA's revenue. As for the name, the March part is easy. It takes place in the month of March. For what the tournament entails, well, for comparison, as of writing of this video, the NCAA has 12 football teams play each other to determine the champion for the year. For basketball, the tournament has 64 teams. They all play each other in a massive single elimination bracket that lasts 6 rounds, all to crown one champion. Now this playoff is crazy enough, but let's up the ante. Can you predict how the whole thing will go? I don't mean just who will win the tournament, I mean the outcome of every single game in every single round. That is something people actually do to compete and bet against each other to see if anyone can predict a perfect tournament bracket. To understand how unlikely that is, there are 63 games in the entire tournament. Assuming that each team has a 50-50 chance to win each game and you pick randomly, the percentage chance of you being spot on is a decimal point and a 1 separated by 16 zeros. That is the madness part. Considering how male-dominated college football is, even to this day, you'd think there'd be little to no involvement with female players until perhaps extremely recently. But women playing college football goes back surprisingly far. The first attested game of gridiron football played by women was in 1892 by students of the women's-only Philadelphia School of Design, now part of Moores College. That's surprisingly progressive considering they're less than a decade removed from Walter Camp's modifications and about 4 years before the punt was introduced for the game. They modified the rules a bit, including prohibiting outright tackling and instead having the running player down by being tagged. Another notable instance of women's football would come 4 years later in 1896. 10 women were invited to participate in a bit of a pre-game spectacle prior to the season closer for, yet again, Princeton, this time against Yale. The girls were split into 2 teams of 5, each wearing colors corresponding to each of the universities. Said game quickly went awry, with one of the players getting tackled by the other 9, including her own teammates. Plays like this, and the general rowdiness of the crowd quickly led the police in attendance to cancel the match due to safety concerns. Remember, this game was taking place during a time where many were considering banning football for being too dangerous for men, so you can imagine how many would think of women doing the same thing. Various such games would continue throughout the decades, often reported on the newspapers with some variation of "Girls Play Football" as the headline. That was until 1970 when a big development occurred. A woman played professionally in a men's league. Not the NFL, mind you, there hasn't been one in the league even to this day. Instead, one Patricia Palinkas was signed to play in the short-lived Atlantic Coast Football League. She played as a holder, a player that holds the ball for the kicker to make a field goal or extra point. This position isn't as technical as others, so most teams, professionals and amateurs, have a player of a different position do double duty, usually the punter. But Palinkas was just a holder. Originally, she was meant to hold the ball for her husband Steven, but he got injured and she played a few games with a different player. Initially helping draw attention to the team due to her gender, she quickly lost interest and left football soon after. The various women would also play in the NCAA's men's-dominated program starting in the 90s. They usually played as either kickers or punters due to many of them having soccer backgrounds and those positions being the least likely to get injured. There's been a variety of professional women's football leagues as well. The most recent and long-standing is the Women's Football Alliance, founded in 2009 and boasting 60 teams across 3 divisions. In the history section of my video essay, I mentioned the Quebec-based McGill University contributed to the development of American football by introducing rugby to Harvard. Despite such an outspoken role, Canada barely had any role developing the game in the US after that point, instead developing their own game. As the video's focus was about football in America, I had to leave out Canada's story, so let's explore it in this one. Compared to the United States, where rugby was the dominant code of football for only about 4 years before switching to gridiron, Canada stuck with it for much longer, with some regions of the country preferring the code for upwards of 50 years since its introduction, with many collegiate and even professional teams developing due to the lower stigma of professional play than in the US. By the 1900s, however, the province of Ontario would go antsy with the state of rugby, seeing the same flaws that plagued the game that Walter Camp saw just 20 years earlier. In 1903, the Ontario Rugby Football Union adopted a resolution called the Burnside Rules, which modified the sport in various ways, including adding the down and distance system, making a new form of gridiron football called Canadian football. Now, it's important to note that while American and Canadian football are similar enough to be in the same family of code, there are a number of differences that the Canadian version has to keep it from getting Americanized, namely having only 3 downs to go 10 yards instead of 4, 12 players on the field instead of 11, and a homegrown type of scoring called the Rouge that's lacking in the American game. Despite the praise it got in Ontario and the explicit inclusion of rule differences to prevent American encroachment, the rest of Canada was hesitant to adopt the Burnside rules and continued to play rugby, some until World War I. That said, many professional teams would either form or switch to Canadian football during the 1910s, with 2 main leagues forming to facilitate play: the IRFU for Ontario and Quebec, and the WIFU for British Columbia and the Prairie Provinces. The professional side of the game grew to the point that in 1958, the 2 unions merged to form the Canadian Football League, or CFL, which is still the main professional league for Canadian football today. Prior to the merger, it's important to note that an organization called the Canadian Rugby Union, or CRU, was used to manage play throughout the country. Originally founded in 1882, the CRU focused on promoting the amateur side of the game, both under the old rugby rules and the newer gridiron rules. After the formation of the CFL, the CRU, eventually changing its name to Football Canada, would form a collegiate athletics organization in 1961 to function as Canada's equivalent to the NCAA. Originally founded as the Canadian Inter-University Athletic Union, it now goes by U Sports, primarily focusing on Canadian football, but much like the NCAA, also has other programs, albeit with a smaller selection. Many of the schools that were integral in developing the Canadian game, such as the aforementioned McGill, compete against each other in U Sports competitions and make up the backbone of Canadian college football. Now there's probably a reason you're unfamiliar with Canadian college football, and that's because it's much smaller than the American game, even relative to each country's population. To compare, the NCAA has over 1,200 schools in its program, with almost 700 of them having a football program across 4 levels of play. Compare that to U Sports, which only has 56 schools, 27 of which have a football program, all competing at the same level. The average viewership of said teams is also much lower than that of the NCAA. In the 2024 season, the average attendance for a U Sports football match was 3,299, which is less than half than even the FCS. The individual university stats are much better. Only one school, Laval, had more than 10,000 attendance per game, and 2 schools didn't even crack 500 per game. The stark difference for the popularity of college football is threefold. Firstly, unlike in America, where the college game had a 50-year head start on the professional play due to stigma of the latter, both versions developed nearly in tandem in Canada. This led to college football being quickly overshadowed by the likes of the CFL. Secondly, football itself isn't the juggernaut in Canada as it is in the United States, with ice hockey being the country's most popular sport, reducing interest in football. Finally, Canada's proximity to the United States means that if you are a fan of football, you're more likely to watch the American version than the Canadian version, with a 2023 study finding more Canadians follow the NFL than the CFL. Still, Canadian college football has a strong devoted fan base despite its size, and many skilled players coming out of the U Sports program, with many even eventually playing in the NFL. U Sports has a bright future, with perhaps a 28th team coming to the program. The Vancouver-based Simon Fraser University is unique, as it's the only Canadian school to be part of the NCAA, and for a while played American football in the organization's Division II. However, due to logistical and financial reasons, the football program was forced to close in 2023. A report just last month stated Simon Fraser is considering moving to U Sports by 2027. Perhaps said program could return for the Canadian variety and grow college football in Canada just that little bit more. A few times in the original video, I showed the win-loss record for a team for a given season. What I didn't show you, to avoid confusion, was the win percentage system that the United States uses to show a team's record. If you ever saw a statistic in American sports that was a decimal followed by 3 digits, I'm going to explain what that is now. If you follow soccer, your preferred league probably uses a points-based system. 3 points for a win, 1 for a draw, and none for a loss. The team with the most points at the end of the season is the winner. Simple. Sports leagues in the US don't do this, instead using the winning percentage system that will generate a number between 0 and 1. This number is calculated by dividing the number of wins a team has by the total number of games played, then rounding to the nearest 1,000th place. A draw counts as half a win. To give you an example, I mentioned in the video that the 2024 Pittsburgh Steelers finished their regular season with 10 wins and 7 losses. Their win percentage would be 10 divided by 17, or 0.588. Why use this more objectively complicated system? A few reasons actually. In the early years of the sport, both the collegiate and professional levels, most teams would determine their own schedules without really any input from the league itself. That meant different teams would play a different number of games each season. If you were to use the 3-1-0 system for this, you could theoretically pad your points totals by playing as many games as possible, since there's technically no penalty for losing. The win percentage system would expose such a scheme and be a better gauge at who has the better record. The system still holds up today. While most FBS teams play 12 games in a season, the Hawaii Rainbow Warriors and whoever plays them play 13 games to offset any weird results due to jet lag. This prevents a team that goes 10-3 to be above a team that's 10-2 when they would have been 9-3 without the extra game. All NFL teams play the same number of games in the regular season, but this system still has its benefits in unusual situations. For the 2022 season, the Buffalo Bills would face off against the Cincinnati Bengals in each of their penultimate games of the season. However, about halfway through the first quarter, one of the Bills players would suffer a cardiac arrest mid-play. Now, he ultimately survived and is in fact still an active player in the NFL as of this video's publication, but at the time his condition was unknown, causing the game to be postponed and eventually cancelled. The first time an NFL game has been cancelled since 1987. That left the Bills and the Bengals with only 16 games in their season compared to 17 for every other team, especially since both of them were in the running for a playoff spot. But the win percentage system kept them in the running and they both made it. Now the win percentage system can also be used on a team's entire history. Using the Steelers again, as of the 2024 season, they have 689 wins, 591 losses, and 22 draws, giving them an all-time win record of 530. You might have noted that I listed the ties after the losses when most of the world puts them between the wins and the losses. You'll also see this in season records if a team records a draw. Why does American football do this? Simply, ties are extremely rare in football. Its scoring system makes draws difficult, and the rules make the tie as difficult to stay as possible. Until this year, the only way a tie could occur is that if the game was tied during regulation, which only happens about 6% of the time, and then no one scored in the 10-minute overtime. Furthermore, ties are only allowed during the regular season. If the above happens in the playoffs, overtime periods are played until one team or the other wins. Let me put the rarity of draws in football into perspective. With only 1 week left in the 2025 regular season at the time of upload, there's only been one tie game throughout, and it's the first tie game since 2022. And there hasn't been a season with more than 2 ties since 1973. This means in any given season, the vast majority of teams, and usually all teams, will not have a single tie on their record, just wins and losses. So it's just easier to record wins and losses for every team and just add a "and one draw" at the end when need be. Other sports in America use the same system. Basketball and hockey outright forbid ties, and baseball only allows ties to stand in rare circumstances that a game cannot be continued or rescheduled. This last happened in 2016 due to a game getting rained out and it being too late in the season to find a time to reschedule the game. So in American sports, draws are a rarity that are put to the side in situations where needed instead of having each team's wins and losses be separated by an extraneous zero. And that's all I have for y'all today. Sorry if this wasn't as polished as my previous video, but I just wanted to get something out there. Now that I have a plural number of videos on this channel, I guess I should say if you like what I'm doing, subscribe and hit that notification button to let you know when new videos are uploaded. I'm K-Shy, thank you for watching, and have a happy 2026.